Greetings everyone, I welcome you to today's episode of Conflicts and Contradictions. Today we will discuss if public sector is a partisan in all those contracts which it is supposed to protect and enforce like a neutral party. Now this is a very strong position to hold, and accordingly my stance is skeptical rather than conclusive or definite. However, reading theory, identifying contradictions therein, studying the expert researches based on data, this doubt inevitably rises. And in this episode, I will share with you my reservations, my reasons for having this doubt, which I came across when studying theory and such other researches. So let us begin our episode. In the last lecture, we investigated the contradictions that arise when the first proposed justification of existence of a public sector is confronted with the conflicts of real life. That is to say, of inequality and discrimination. The first proposed justification was that we need public sector to ensure no barriers to market entry exist, and thus markets remain competitive and efficient. This contradicts with reality when inequality is sharp, institutional subversion exists, and discrimination of gender and race prevails. All of this bars people from entering in market for competition, be it labor market or product market, that is to say doing your own business. Now in this episode we move further and evaluate the second proposed justification of public sector in a private enterprise economy as provided by Musgrove and Musgrove in their book named Public Finance, 4th edition, in chapter 1 in section named The Need for Public Sector. The second of the 7 points is, more generally, the contractual arrangements and exchanges needed for market operations cannot exist without the protection and enforcement of a governmentally provided legal structure. Now, since this series aims to investigate the conflicts and contradictions, the most important social conflict we face is the conflict between haves and have-nots, which manifests itself in an economy as inequality of income or wealth. And in terms of contractual agreements, it manifests as the opposition between labor and capital, or workers and business owners, and as such, the contracts between workers and business owners are the most frequent and most important contracts in the market. Using this perspective, we will investigate the proposed justification of public sector as an enforcer of contracts. However, before we begin, let us outline our episode, the two sections it has. In the first section, I begin in its first part by identifying a logical contradiction in the proposed justification of public sector in a private enterprise economy by means of the very narrative or the theory of free market economy. In the next section, I provide observational evidence based on formal research done by Bernhardt and her colleagues on the violation of the labor laws, which go without any legal penalty. This provides the strongest contradiction we can observe, and these two form the first half of our episode. In the second half, I proceed with a doubt. I provide some reservations that perhaps the public sector is itself a partisan in contracts rather than being a neutral enforcer and protector of the contracts. I proceed with some observations and strengthen the doubt based on some historical observations. Finally, I present the results of Gilens and Page. They have conducted a formal research published by Princeton University, which provides even stronger evidence in favor of the doubt. I finished my episode with a summary and two questions for you to think. So let us proceed to the first section of the first part regarding the theoretical contradictions. The idea of the free market is essentially explained and justified by its narrative, which is the mainstream microeconomics. Without going into its needless mathematics, I will simply point out its fundamentals, which are two. The axiom of rationality, which is usually defined as using all available information to maximize self-interest. And self-interest in a capitalist economics is inevitably monetary in nature. Second, the axiom of lack of local satiation, which is defined as having no satiation at any given point. That is to say, we always want more. Reading these two together in a layman's language, in our daily language, a language which you and I use and everyone can understand, these two mean the pursuit of never-ending greed. The pursuit of never-ending greed, since only self-interest is emphasized, not the social interest. And in economics, it means money. Moreover, a lack of local satiation implies it is never-ending. Thus, the pursuit of never-ending greed forms the core of the right-winged narrative of economics. We note that it is not a balance of interests of each other, an empathy, a care for interests of the others, a altruistic behavior, or anything close to it, but only maximizing of self-interest, and in a manner that one is never satiated at any time. Thus, it is essentially greed and a never-ending pursuit of it, which is at the core of the mainstream economic narrative, which is also the right-winged narrative. With these two axioms or beliefs, the economists of private enterprise economy proceed and study everything. They view everything through the lens of these two beliefs. We should note that a theoretical critique is needed here because if we can show it is absurd, we have already made a very strong point. Now, for our purpose of identifying theoretical contradictions, we proceed theoretically and conduct a thought experiment. You now imagine yourself in a world where each individual, everyone, including you and I, everyone pursues nothing but self-interest. That is to say, a never-ending greed of wealth of money, of power, of possession of material goods, etc. This is axiomatic and universal. In this world, no person ever works for anything opposite to that of pursuance of never-ending greed. Anyone who wishes to prevail pursues greed and vice versa. And as such, it is never-ending. Think about it and imagine further that a dispute arises between two individuals and that the two were in a contractual agreement and that one claims that the other has violated it, yet the other denies having done so. However, it remains unclear who is telling the truth, since there is no neutral person to observe contracts and enforce them. Thus, to avoid such a dispute in future, they both elect an individual who acts as a neutral and receives a wage to enforce and protect all the subsequent contracts made under his or her supervision. Since everyone only pursues greed, which is never ending, can such a neutral enforcer exist? How about a payment to the enforcer in excess to its wage by one of the two contracting parties to subvert? Since greed is fundamental here, the payment will be accepted by enforcer, and a blind eye will be turned to the contractual violation, and enforcement will cease to exist practically. However, the game is not played once, and there are many contracts and many individuals, and such things do not go unnoticed. Some individuals may point out this issue. Then, the individuals whose interests are threatened will react and demand that this party must resign. Here, in line with the broader theme of this series, we assume that the world is marked with inequalities. So there are richer and there are poorer individuals, as there are more informed and less informed individuals. In this world of asymmetric information, asymmetric distribution of resources, and the symmetric pursuance of greed, the less informed, the less wealthy can easily be cheated, and the weaker cannot do anything, since they cannot buy the enforcers. Since the price of enforcers is naturally high, since the enforcer sells themselves to the highest bidder. Demand drives the prices. And as such, the enforcer is the only enforcer. That is to say, there exists no enforcer to enforce the contracts and laws upon this existing enforcer. And thus, even if everyone knows it, no one can do anything, since both it is a norm in this world to pursue the never-ending greed, and at once less of the two wealthy cannot offer anything to enforce any contracts because it has lesser resources. And what makes this worse is that all the weaker cannot even unite and gather their resources for paying to the enforcer to enforce each of their contracts as they ought to be, because in each case the richer can always afford to pay more, unless they cannot, which is a rarity. Moreover, this union of all the weaker individuals whose contracts have been violated can fall apart as soon as few of them or the leader of this union is tipped off with more money, a solution to his only problem, a fulfillment of his only contract. And this will happen inevitably since everyone only pursues a creed which is as large as life or worse larger than that. Thus, in such a world where rationality and lack of local satiation, that is to say, pursuance of never ending greed, is the norm, in such a world of misery and greed, no neutral enforcer or protector of contracts can exist. And this impossibility points to the contradiction to the proposed justification of public sector as an enforcer and protector of contracts in a private enterprise economy. That is to say, in an economy whose very narrative, the very theory which explains it, is built on the beliefs and values of never ending greed and a never ending pursuit of it. Every action by the weaker, be the weak due to less information or less resources or whatsoever, will be countered by stronger and richer because enforcer can always provide more information to the highest bidder, which is always the richer, and also turn a blind eye to the violations when provided money to do so, which can only be provided by the richer. Hence, to propose a justification of public sector in a private enterprise using axioms of or beliefs of private enterprise economy is an absurdity. The public sector will always remain a partisan unless we change our underlying narrative and its foundations, or the beliefs and values which dictate the theory, which in turn shape the practice. Now let us turn to the next section where we see if there are any real violations of the contracts. In this second section of part 1 of our episode, I will concern myself with only labor law violations in line with aforementioned reasons. That is to say, the most important conflict of our life is between haves and have nots, which takes the shape of labor against capital in capitalism. Moreover, in line with the preceding discussion, we would like to see how the rights of the weakest, most vulnerable, are protected and enforced in United States. Especially in line with the previous discussion, that is to say, the weakest always suffers and their contracts violated in a world dominated by unending pursuance of greed, we should be interested in non-trivial and frequent violations of the contracts of the most vulnerable of all workers, which happens to be hourly wagers, frontline workers, and others. It is a tough task since the data can be difficult to obtain, but fortunately, in year 2009, Bernhardt and her colleagues did exactly raise this question and provide a substantial material, which I will simply summarize. Bernhardt and her fellows conducted a landmark survey of 4,000 plus workers in low-wage industries in the large cities of United States, including Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Now you can view this table here, and it shows that of all the 4,000 plus workers surveyed, 25.9% were paid below the minimum wage, whereas 19.1% had overtime violations in the week prior to survey. All these results are for 1 week prior to the survey. Here you should also remember that the second column can be ignored, because second column measures something like this, that if some workers worked overtime, the second column will show you the percentage of all those workers who worked overtime out of the total sample of 4,000 plus workers. You can also see meal break violations and other violations. And if this week in which the survey was conducted was an average week of the labor of United States of America, then we should know that these percentages repeat themselves every week. And so if you can get your hands on some data and find out that how many are the minimum wage workers, how many are the hourly wage workers, you can multiply the percentages and understand that how many violations occurred in a week. You can see in this table there are also violations reported for a 12 months period prior to survey, and we see that workers who faced any sort of violation of their pay constitute 44%, almost 44% of the total sample. And that is just out of 4,000 workers, and if you multiply it with, let's say, only 1 million, you would see a huge number. Whereas in fact there are more than 1 million workers who work in low wage or daily wagers or hourly wagers, minimum wagers, and so on. Now, one thing which is very critical and is to be noticed as it was that workers were denied or got shortened rest break, which is staggering 77%. Moving next, we can see the pie charts which show the further division of each of the contractual violation. For example, this chart on the left shows the amount paid below the hourly minimum wage for the minimum wage violations, and you can see 25%, 16%, 8.7, 9.6, they all together form 59.6% approximately who were paid at least $1 less than their actual wage in the week preceding to the survey. And if it was an ordinary week, just like any other week, this happens every week then. And if this happens every week, and you can somehow get the number of people who work in minimum wage, low wage industries, just multiply 60% with that number, you will know the number of violations that occur every week. On the right side, we have the similar graph for number of hours worked overtime beyond 40 hours for the workers with an overtime violation. And here too, 25.6, 26.5, and 12.4% form roughly 65% or 64.6% of the total workers who worked at least 5 hours above 40 hours and faced an overtime violation. Again, you can multiply it with the total number of people who work in the low wage industries to get an idea as to how many workers faced a contractual violation in the week in which the survey occurred. And if the week in which the survey occurred was a regular week, these violations occur every week. Now, how should you use this survey? And I recommend that everyone should read this survey. How should you use the percentages of this survey. I can give you one example. And in this slide, I have worked it out. Please remember that in year 2016 that there were estimated 80 million minimum wage workers in US, and if only half of these are vulnerable ones, the percentages shown portray a dismal reality in line with the above said conclusions. That is to say, it is not possible for the weaker to have his or her rights protected in a world designed by the axioms of right-winged capital narrative. So you remember that 25.9% of the total workers surveyed in the week before the survey occurred faced a violation of their minimum wage. They were underpaid. And of these 25.9%, 25.6% were paid $1 or $2 less. If we have 80 million, let's say, minimum wagers, this becomes 5 million workers exploited in 1 week. And if this was an ordinary week, we can easily multiply it with 48 weeks, which becomes 240 million instances of exploitation over an year. It's not the number of individuals, it is the number of total instances of exploitation, where a worker was paid $1 or $2 less every week. Now, of course, in this, the caveat is that I use the number 80 million, which may or may not represent the actual figure, but if you can get your hands on the actual figures, you can do this kind of mathematics with each percentage given in the table and the pie charts. As a matter of fact, you may also multiply them with the dollars. Like, for example, in case of 240 million instances, they were paid $1 or $2 less. That means either 240 or maximum 480 million dollars surplus was exploited. This surplus resulted through exploitation of workers in 1 year. That is very large. So proceed in this way with this survey and you can find more insights. But what does this survey tells us for the vulnerable workers? What does this observation of the most vulnerable workers suggest? These observations of the most vulnerable workers suggest only one thing, which is in fact a restatement of the previous logical contradiction where weaker always ends up having contracts violated. That is to say, despite that the proposed justification that public sector exists to protect and enforce contracts in market, the weaker in labor market repeatedly face violations of their legal rights and all other contractual arrangements or agreements, and this violation, which is frequent and non-trivial, goes unpunished. That is to say that public sector in its practice contradicts the very justification for its existence. Hence an empirical evidence based on a formal research supporting the earlier logical contradiction I identified. Moreover, the authors suggest that these violations occur because the penalties for many workplace violations are so modest that they fail to deter many employers. That is to say, the cost of violating a law is less than the benefit of violating a law or contract. And this point needs to be remembered as it will be useful in our coming discussion. The laws protecting the contractual arrangements between labor and capital or worker and business owners are weak enough to fail to deter the employer from violating the contract. And the presence of such modest or weak laws which fail to protect the contracts provide us with some evidence to strengthen the doubt that it is not possible for the weaker to have his or her rights protected in a world designed by the axioms or the beliefs of the right-winged capitalist narrative. Perhaps we need a new narrative, a narrative based on social values and construction of society by serving social development for the good of the society, which is composed mainly of workers. With this, let us move to the next section. Finally, coming to the second section of our episode, I will first share my reservations based on few observations that public sector may in fact be a partisan. In every contract, it is supposed to enforce and protect, and then provide an evidence in its favor using a formal research done by Gilens and Page from the Princeton University. Finally, I will leave it for you to think and ask for yourself if there are observations which make it conclusive, what I am only suggesting to be true. So, to begin with, we have not only non-trivial violations of labor laws without penalty, but we have observations in the United States, say, of weakening of laws, a bias against raising of the minimum wage. The recent debate of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in favor of 15 US dollars and the opposition she faces is telling. It tells that there are forces, strong ones, who can affect the decisions of public sector and its policies against the raise of minimum wage in favor of the capitalists for whom a raise in minimum wage is a cost. The weakening of labor unions and laws against them are additional observations we may consider. Moreover, we observe that the public sector, which needs taxes to conduct its needed activities, has now lower tax rates for the rich and easier laws for tax avoidance. All of this combined, that is to say, the weaker labor laws, opposition of minimum wage, weakening of tax laws, laws which encourage tax avoidance, lowering of tax rates for the rich, is telling something, perhaps like this. The public sector, which essentially works under the elected government, has now a favor for the rich and some bias against the workers. Add to it a reversing of Obamacare, weakening of health insurance laws, privatization of education, and so on. Before we proceed to the summary of the formal research done by Gilens and Page, let me recall something from our history. During the Middle Ages, or in all our history of feudalism, the kings who were most powerful in a country would make laws and dictate them. For example, the King of England would defeat the Scotland and make some arbitrary law for confiscating their income and justify it as repayment for the losses of war which Scots initiated. Whereas truth may be the opposite, not just for the Scots, but for wherever kings ever existed and ruled. The lesson of this example is simple. In history, we have seen that powerful who could subjugate others had made laws and had enforced them, had violated them when needed, had escaped penalties, had reshaped laws, had made new laws, discarded the old ones, and did whatever pleased them, given the resources they had. Since a law either acts as a contract itself or shapes the contract, helps enforce and protect contracts. The important insight we have here is that the powerful can subvert, or put simply, our history has been shaped by the powerful. And the laws and contracts are no exception to their power. Now, the question that arises is our present today too is shaped by powerful as our past was, especially now that we have democracies? A research by Princeton University researchers Gilens and Page throw some light on this issue, and I am summarizing their findings below. Now, the authors dig into the past to identify if the policy position or a desire to change policy by the average citizen results in a policy change, which is something we would expect in a democracy. Or is it the economic elites whose preferences dictate the policy? In earlier case, we have democracy, and in later we have oligarchy of the few rich. They used a unique approach which I would briefly explain before sharing their results. They used the survey data from United States between 1981 to 2002 and collected around 1,700 plus observations or responses to all the survey questions from which they could measure if respondents favored a policy change or not. Since the survey also records the income categories of respondents, this made it possible for the authors of this research to divide entire data into two large groups. Those belonging to the upper 10% with respect to income distribution, and those who earn the average income. Thus, the two categories are entitled as economic elite and the average citizen, and their responses likewise represent the proxy for the class they belong to. This classification assists them to see how the actual policy changed over time after a particular position on policy change was held by each of the two groups. The authors say that for each policy choice, that is to say, if respondents favored a policy change at a particular year, they looked in next 4 years if a policy change occurred in accordance with the preferences. Then they check if the policy change was more sensitive to the choices of and preferences of the economic elite or the ordinary average citizen. They summarize their results in graphs which present us with a probability of a policy change in response to the change in policy preferences of the two groups. Let us view these graphs now. Before we proceed, let us remember that a probability means a chance, and it is represented in a number between 0 and 1. If you multiply it with 100, you get an interpretation that such is the times a desirable event occurs out of each 100 times. For example, in a dice throw, the probability of having 1 is 1 by 6, or for each 100 dice throws, there will be somewhere between 16 to 17 times when you would see 1 to appear on the top. Let us now observe these graphs. In the graph on the left, we measure chances or probability of a policy change in 4 years in response to formation of an opinion by the majority, that is to say, the average income earners. On the right, we measure the same for the economic elite. The vertical left axis measures the probability of a policy change in coming 4 years, and the horizontal axis measures the fraction of population which is in favor of a policy change. The dark black line represents the relation between the two. That is to say, it shows the probability of a policy change in 4 years in response to formation of an opinion. The total number of observations they used are 1770 plus, and this result holds true for all the policies they could come across. And for a moment we can ignore the vertical axis on the right side and the corresponding gray boxes on the horizontal axis. Now there are two very critical observations to be made here on the graph on the left side before we can compare it with the other graph. First, whether 10% of the majority, that is to say 10% of the average income earners, favor a policy change or 100%, that is to say a unanimous agreement prevails. In either case of a total disagreement among ordinary people and a total agreement among ordinary people in favor of a policy change, the probability of a policy change in coming 4 years always remains the same and way below 0.5. Remember how to interpret the probability. What does this tell us? It tells us that no matter what people think, agree with, form a consensus upon, no matter if the majority of the average income earners want a policy change, this unanimous consensus has the same impact as if only a minority of them wants a particular policy change. That is to say, a consensus of majority has no impact on policy change. And this is a very strong and direct opposition of democracy for and by people. Second, the black line always remains a bit above 0.25, only a few points above the quarter of the cases. Or just put it simply, in only a few above quarter of the cases, the policy changes as desired by the public. And all such changes may be wanted by everyone, or perhaps only by 10% of the average income earners. Or put it in other way around. In around 70 out of 100 cases, the opinions and the preferences of ordinary people are ignored when policy changes are implemented. Regardless, a particular policy change is favored by 1/10 or 9/10 of all the ordinary citizens. Contrary to it, you can observe how the dark line representing the probability of a policy change in accordance with the formation of consensus for a policy change moves proportionally in case of the rich elite. It shows that the probability of a policy change in coming 4 years in response to the formation of an opinion by the rich rises sharply and consistently from around zero when the consensus among elites is around zero to above 0.6 when their consensus reaches unanimous. The question is, whose preferences does the policy represent? Or to whose policy preferences does public sector respond when making policies? Clearly, the economic elite. They also report the similar findings for the interest groups, and they say that among them, those representing the interests of the working class, such as labor unions, are only a small fraction. whereas the business interest groups essentially work in the opposite direction. And there too, the policy shows similar sensitivity as in the case of economic elites. And thus, the author concludes that the democracy in United States is a democracy by and for rich, or in simple words, the plutocracy prevails. Now, what is the relevance of this for our topic of contractual violations? If their findings are indeed correct, which appears to be the case, and there indeed is plutocracy, that is to say, the government by the few rich for the few rich, then there is a reason to believe that public sector, which is nothing in a democracy on its own, but essentially functions under the elected government, such a public sector is indeed a partisan in every contract between the rich and the non-rich, between capital and labor, between business owners and workers, between haves and have-nots. Since policies made by public sector can strengthen or weaken the enforcement of contracts, and if public sector is a partisan in contracts between rich and non-rich, the policies to enforce such contracts will accordingly be leaning in favor of the rich. And as such, the research done by Bernhardt also suggests that the laws enforcing workers' contracts are so modest that they fail to protect labor from violation of its contractual rights. And thus, we have a very strong reason to doubt if public sector itself is a part of the very social conflict we have, that is to say, between haves and have-nots. Which once again brings us to the initial theoretical contradiction we examined, which was an impossibility to have a neutral enforcer in a world dominated by the pursuit of greed. Here, let us recall Karl Marx, who had much insight about all of this issue, and most important is that his insight was based on a thorough critique of his time, which is still as needed as then. He said, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. On this quote of Karl Marx, from here on, I leave further research to you to decide as to how things really are. Is public sector a partisan? Now let us summarize our findings, after which I give you two questions to think about and research. First of all, let us restate the proposed justification of having a public sector in a private enterprise economy. More generally, the contractual arrangements and exchanges needed for market operations cannot exist without the protection and enforcement of a governmentally provided legal structure. Now, the most frequent contracts in our world are contracts between labor and capital, or workers and owners of the business. The first contradiction, which is theoretical, is that the neutral contract enforcer and protector is impossible in a theoretical world where everyone is rational and lack of local satiation prevails. That is to say, an unending greed, a never ending pursuance of greed dominates. In a world designed by this belief, we cannot have a neutral protector and enforcer of contracts. The second is that the frequent, non-trivial, non-consequential violations of the labor laws are evidence in favor of this aforementioned contradiction. Observations do not support, in fact, negate the proposed justification of public sector. Next, the history, the recent opposition of raising minimum wage to 15 US dollars, the lowering of the tax for the rich, making laws which help tax avoidance, and all other observations are supportive of a doubt. Perhaps public sector is a partisan in contracts which it must protect and enforce. Finally, the Princeton University research suggests that government under which public sector always works is indeed by the few, for the few, rich. Thus, it makes public sector a partisan in the contracts of the nature we mentioned before. Coming to the questions that you should think about, the first question is, what are the frequent non-trivial violations of contracts relating to women, say due to marriage or other relevant laws of contracts, and the same for contracts involving racial minorities? Second, what further evidence is there to support the proposed skeptical stance? That is to say, public sector is indeed a partisan in contracts of most frequent nature, such as labor contracts or others, or is there evidence against it? This finishes our episode, and I emphasize that you go through these two questions that I gave you. So, what should we do next? While Musgrave and Musgrave propose 7 justifications of having a public sector in a private enterprise economy, I believe this episode and also the observations I gave you in the previous episode are sufficient and strong enough to counter any proposed justification of having a public sector in a private enterprise economy. So we should move next, and in coming 2 episodes I will cover war and wealth. Starting from war, I am personally against war. I think all war is irrational and unjust, and I will defend my position in coming episode and also explain under what conditions and to what extent we may justify war. But overall, I think that war is an irrational approach. Till then, happy researching. Take care. See you very soon.